Good afternoon. Welcome to the Covenant Fine Arts Center Recital Hall. My name is Michael Wiltskett, and I serve as the director of the January series here at Calvin University. 2024 has been an exciting year for the January series as we've lived into our new year-round programming. So our flagship program in January, where Dr. George joined us virtually, in addition to our spring event with Kent District Library, our January series in July, and now our first ever fall event, bringing Dr. George back to campus physically. So we're super excited. Thank you for coming and joining us today. The January series is in full prep mode for January 2025. We're excited to share that lineup with you in the coming weeks as well too, for all those great guests who will join us again in January. And now I'd like to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Micah Watson, who will introduce today's guest.
Thank you, Michael. I have the privilege of directing the Paul Henry Institute for the Study of Christianity and Politics, and it's a privilege to introduce our speaker this afternoon. In thinking about how to do that, I have witnessed many introductions of our speaker. I was reminded of the exchange between Jesus and an expert in the law that precedes the much more famous account of the parable of the Good Samaritan. The expert asked Jesus how he can inherit eternal life, and Jesus steals a page from Socrates by responding to a question with a question. What is written in the law? How do you read it? Jesus says. And this in itself is rather remarkable, that Jesus, the Son of God and Son of Man, and the Word of God himself, asks a mere man what he thinks of the Word of God. The expert in the law responds with the greatest commandment about loving the Lord your God with all your heart, strength, soul, mind, and the second greatest in loving your neighbor as yourself. Jesus says, this is correct. Do this and you will live. And the expert asks the famous question, who is my neighbor? Who is our neighbor? Who belongs to the human family? It is this question that I think defines a common thread for the career of Robert George. Even more than the academic pedigree that started with a philosophical awakening when reading the Gorgias from Plato at Swarthmore, and continued on to Harvard Law School, Harvard Divinity School, and then Oxford University. More than the 4 decades at Princeton, with an occasional semester slumming up at Harvard. More than the many books and articles and lectures, and even more than founding the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions 24 years ago. More than his remarkable banjo and bluegrass playing skills, and even more significant than his sharing a birthday, July 10, with John Calvin. More than all these things, as impressive as they are, I'm most struck by Robbie George's work asking us to consider, who is my neighbor? Who belongs to the human family? Do the disabled belong? Do those who look differently than we do, or worship in ways we find strange? Or the most vulnerable among us, the unborn? Do they belong to the human family such that they should be protected in law and welcomed in life? Robert George, given his background in teaching, is indeed an expert in the law. But even before that, he is a follower of Jesus Christ, and he asks us, as he has for the last 40 years, who is our neighbor? It's with great pleasure I ask you to join me in welcoming him to Calvin University.
Thank you so very, very much. It is a tremendous honor to be at Calvin College and a special privilege to be introduced by my beloved star student, Micah Watson. Micah was one of my earliest graduate students, and he set the standard very, very high for those who came after him. And I want to express my gratitude, Micah, for all that you have done for the students that you have gone on to teach. I see teaching as a kind of chain. I look to my professors and what they did for me, and then I've tried to do that for my students like Micah, and I take great satisfaction then when I see Micah teaching my grand students. And pretty soon I'll have a generation of them who will be teaching my great grand students. But I am awfully, awfully proud of Micah. And what a delight to be with my dear old friend, Elsa Prince. Elsa, thank you so much for coming out. And of course, I do want to thank Michael for the invitation to be here to give this lecture. As I say, it's a very great honor. I have a couple of requests for the audience. My lecture this afternoon, I'm afraid, is somewhat academic, and maybe not in the best sense of that word. It is somewhat abstract. But I myself think that philosophy is not of much use if it's intelligible only to other philosophers. Philosophy lives up to its highest aspiration when it's intelligible to any thoughtful person. So my first request is that if anything I say is unclear, in the Q&A, make me make it clear to you. The second thing is this: I'm going to set for myself a series of questions, and then I'm going to try to answer those questions. If I fail to answer them satisfactorily, I want you to hold me to account. In the Q&A, challenge me. Make me defend what I've asserted. So let me begin by saying what some of those questions are. What is natural law? What is a theory of natural law a theory of? What is a natural law theory of human dignity? What is a natural law theory of human rights? Do ideas and beliefs about God and the divine play a role in natural law theory? What, if anything, distinguishes natural law theories of morality and justice from other alternative theories or accounts or approaches? How are natural law theories similar to and different from other leading theories or understandings or approaches to morality, especially those major schools of thought known as utilitarianism and Kantianism or deontologism? And then finally, are natural law theories fundamentally concerned with rules, moral rules, or with virtues? My task is to answer those questions. A natural law theory is a critical reflective account of the constitutive aspects of human well-being and fulfillment, the fulfillment of human persons and the communities that we form. Now, that's a very abstract opening statement. They're theories of what makes for and detracts from a valuable and worthy way of life. They are theories of what makes for our fulfillment as the kinds of creatures we are and what detracts from our fulfillment. So such a theory will propose to identify principles of right action, that's what we mean by moral principles, which specify the first and most general principle of morality, which I would formulate this way: that one should choose and act in ways that are compatible with the will toward integral human fulfillment. That is, the complete fulfillment of human beings in all the dimensions of our lives: the biological, physical, the intellectual, cognitive, the moral or characterological, the social, the spiritual. Now, among these principles are respect for rights people possess simply by virtue of their humanity. In other words, rights that we have simply as human beings, not because we're tall, not because we're of this race or that race, not because we're of this religion or that religion, not because we have great achievements as opposed to relatively minor achievements. Rights we have simply in virtue of our humanity. Rights which, as a matter of justice, others are bound to respect, and governments are bound not only to respect, but to the extent possible to protect. Now, natural law theorists, at least of my persuasion, understand human fulfillment, the human good, as variegated. I've already signaled that to you by noting that we can flourish or fail to flourish in respect of our biological health, in respect of our intellectual or cognitive well-being, in respect of our character, in respect of our sociability, in respect of our spiritual lives, our relationship with God. Now, this is in no way to deny that human nature is determinate. Obviously, I believe human nature is determinate. There is such a thing as human nature. It doesn't change. It is to affirm that our nature, though determinate, is complex. There are many different dimensions of human well-being and fulfillment. We are complex creatures. We are animals, but rational. Our integral good includes our bodily well-being, being healthy rather than being sick, but also our intellectual and moral and social and spiritual well-being. We are individuals. That's how we come packaged. But friendship and sociability are constitutive aspects of our well-being and fulfillment. No one is flourishing if he or she is friendless. Now, by reflecting on these basic goods, as I'll call them, of human nature, especially those most immediately pertaining to social and political life, natural law theorists propose to arrive at a sound understanding of principles of justice, including those principles of justice we call human rights. Now, in light of what I've already said about how natural law theorists understand human nature and the human good, it should be no surprise to learn that natural law theorists typically reject both strict or extreme individualism of the Ayn Randian sort on the one side, and collectivism of the communist or socialist sort on the other side. Individualism overlooks the intrinsic value, not merely instrumental value, the intrinsic value of human sociability, and tends mistakenly to view human beings atomistically. It fails to account for the intrinsic value of friendship and other aspects of human sociability. We form bonds with each other not only as means to other ends, but for the sake of the flourishing that we are able to achieve simply in virtue of this friendship, or this marriage, or this other social relationship. Collectivism, on the other side, compromises the dignity of human beings by tending to instrumentalize and subordinate them and their well-being to the interests of larger social units, the community, the state, the Volk, the fatherland, the Führer, the future communist utopia. Individualists and collectivists both have theories of justice and human rights, but they are, as I see it, highly unsatisfactory. They're rooted in important misunderstandings of a human person, that is, a rational creature who is a locus of intrinsic value, and as such an end in himself, who may never legitimately treat himself or be treated by others as a mere means to other ends, but whose well-being, whose fulfillment intrinsically includes relationships with other people and membership in communities, beginning with the basic community of the family, mom, dad, kids, in which he or she has, as a matter of justice, both rights and responsibilities. Human rights obtain or exist if it's the case that there are principles of practical reason, principles of moral judgment, directing us to act or abstain from acting in certain ways out of respect for the well-being, in other words to say, the dignity, of persons whose legitimate interests may be affected by what we do. Now, I certainly believe that there are such principles, so I'm a believer in human rights. Not everyone is. Not all philosophers are. We have people who are severely critical of rights language, who identify it with that extreme individualism that I've already said we should reject. But I do believe that there are such principles, and they cannot be overridden by other concerns, such as the concern to advance social utility. At a very general level, these principles we call human rights, which include our basic civil liberties, freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion, and so forth, direct us, in Immanuel Kant's famous phrase, to treat human beings always as ends in themselves and never as means only. Don't reduce other people just to means, the way the slave owner reduces the slave to a mere means to his ends. Whatever interactions, whatever services they perform for us, we must also at the same time understand them and regard them as ends in themselves, as having fundamental dignity and worth. When we begin to specify this norm, we identify important negative duties, such as the duty that today everyone recognizes, although in earlier times throughout most of human history people didn't recognize it. That is the duty not to enslave other people. Now, although we need not put the matter in terms of rights, we needn't use that rights language, I think it's perfectly reasonable to use it, and I believe it can even be helpful to use it. So we speak, for example, of a right against being enslaved, or of slavery as a violation of human rights. It's a right that people have not by being members of a certain race or class or sex or ethnicity, but simply by virtue of our humanity. In that sense, precisely in that sense, it's a human right. If it was a right we had in virtue of being tall rather than short, white rather than black, Croatian rather than Bulgarian, or what have you, then it wouldn't be a human right. A human right is a right we have simply in virtue of our humanity, which means that every human being has that right, no matter how weak, no matter how poor, no matter how vulnerable, no matter how despised. If it's a human right, then every human has it. But in addition to these negative duties and corresponding rights, there are also certain positive duties. And these too can be articulated and discussed in the language of rights, as we have, for example, in the UN, the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights of 1948, that I'm sure some of you are familiar with. Though here, when we're talking about positive rights as opposed to negative rights, we're talking about rights to things, education, healthcare, and so forth, as opposed to rights against things, being enslaved, being subjected to prohibitions of your speech or your religion or what have you. Here it's especially important that we be clear about by whom and how a given right is to be honored. Sometimes it's said, for example, that education or healthcare is a human right. Now, it's certainly not unreasonable, in my view, to speak this way, but much more needs to be said, and usually isn't said, if it's to be a meaningful statement. Since much more usually isn't said, it's usually not a meaningful statement. It's just a slogan. If we want to get serious, we have to raise such questions as who is supposed to provide education or health care to whom? Why should those persons or institutions be the providers? What place should the provision of education or health care occupy on the list of social and political priorities? Is it better for education or health care to be provided by governments in socialized systems, or by private providers in markets, or by some combination of public and private? Now, these questions, you'll notice, go beyond the application of moral principles. A strict moral analysis will not by itself resolve them. They require prudential judgments in light of the contingent circumstances people face in a given society at a given point in time, and often in light of that society's history and traditions and social understandings. Often there's not a single uniquely correct answer. There's not a single uniquely correct healthcare system, in the same way that there's not a single uniquely correct Constitution. I rather like our Constitution, the Constitution of the United States. Does every nation have to have a constitution like ours to be a just nation? No. Could every nation have a constitution like ours? Actually, no. There are certain conditions that have to be in place for a constitution like ours to work, conditions over which we do not have anything approaching immediate control. So the answer to each question can lead to further questions, and the problems can be extremely complex, far more complex than the issue of, say, slavery, where once a right has been identified, its universality and the basic terms of its application are fairly clear. Everybody has a moral right not to be enslaved, and everybody has a moral obligation, that is an obligation as a matter of justice, to refrain from enslaving other people. Governments have a moral obligation to respect and protect the right, and correspondingly to enforce the obligation. Now, what I've said so far should give you a pretty good idea of how I think we ought to go about identifying what are, in fact, human rights and then specifying them. But in each case, the argument has to be made. You can't do this wholesale. It's a retail business. You have to make the case for this understanding of the right to healthcare, this understanding of the right to education and so forth. And in many cases, there are complexities to the argument and not uniquely correct answers. One basic human right that almost all natural law theorists would say belongs in the set is the right of an innocent person not to be directly killed or maimed. This is a right that is violated when someone makes the death or injury of another person the precise object of his action. And it's this right that grounds the norm against targeting non-combatants, even in justified wars, against elective abortion, euthanasia, the killing of hostages, and so forth. Now, the natural law understanding of human rights that I'm here sketching is connected with a particular account of human dignity, and I promised that I would give you that account and defend it. Under that account, the natural human capacities for reason and freedom are fundamental to the dignity of human beings, the dignity that is protected by human rights. Those basic goods of human nature are the goods of a rational creature, that is, a creature with a rational nature, a creature who, unless impaired or prevented from doing so, naturally develops and exercises capacities for deliberation, judgment, choice, and action. These capacities, I put it to you, are God-like, albeit, of course, in a limited way. In fact, from the theological vantage point, they constitute a certain sharing, limited to be sure, but nevertheless real, in divine power. This is what is meant. In fact, I think it's the only thing that could be meant by the otherwise completely puzzling biblical teaching that man, though made from the mere dust of the earth, is nevertheless fashioned in the very image and likeness of God. But whether or not one recognizes biblical authority or even believes in a personal God, it's true that human beings possess a power traditionally associated with or ascribed to divinity, namely genuine agency. That is, the power that an agent has to cause what the agent is not caused to cause. This is the power to envisage a state of affairs, a possible state of affairs that does not yet exist, to understand or grasp the intelligible point, the value of bringing it into existence, and then to act freely on one's judgment of the value of bringing that state of affairs into existence, to bring it into existence, not on impulse or by instinct like a brute animal, but on the basis of one's rational grasp of the value, the intelligible point of bringing it into existence. Now, that state of affairs may be anything from the development of an intellectual skill or the attainment of an item of knowledge, to the creation or appreciation of a work of art, to the establishment and maintenance of a friendship. Its moral or cultural significance may be great, or more commonly, comparatively minor. What matters for the point I'm now making is that it is a product of human reason and freedom, those godlike powers of reason and freedom. Those powers, the possession of which explain what is meant by our being made in the image and likeness of God, since after all, God doesn't have 5 fingers on each of 2 hands and hair on his head and a nose. How could we be godlike? It's not our physical being, it's our agency, our freedom and reason. Now, of course, a further question will present itself to the inquiring mind, the mind of anyone who recognizes the godlikeness of our capacities for rationality and freedom, capacities that are immaterial, and thus one can say spiritual in nature. And that question is whether beings capable of such powers could exist apart from a divine source and ground of their being. So one finds in the affirmation of these powers a ground for the rejection of materialism, a quite decisive ground for the rejection of materialism. And one discerns the basis of an openness, or even the roots of an argument for theism, the idea of a personal God. But more on that point in a moment or two. Now, what about the authority for this view of human nature, the human good, human dignity, and human rights? Well, natural law theorists are interested in the intelligible reasons people have for their choices and actions. We are particularly interested in reasons that can be identified without appeal to any authority apart from the authority of reason itself. Now, this is not to deny that it's often reasonable to recognize and submit to, say, religious authority or even secular authority, such as legal authority, in deciding what to do and not do. This is not an argument against authority. Indeed, the natural law tradition has made important contributions to understanding why and how people can sometimes be morally bound to submit to and be guided by, in their actions, authority of various types: the authority of the Bible, the authority of the Christian tradition, the authority of the civil law, and so forth. But even here, the special concern of natural law theorists is with the reasons people have for recognizing and honoring claims to authority. We do not simply appeal to authority to justify authority. One might even ask whether human beings are in fact rational in anything more than an instrumental sense. Can we discern any intelligible reasons at all for human choices and actions? Well, everybody recognizes that some ends or purposes pursued through human action are intelligible, at least insofar as they provide means to other ends. For example, people work to earn money, and their doing so is perfectly rational. We're not puzzled that people work to earn money. Why? Because you can do valuable things with money. Money is valuable to a great many other important ends: feeding your family, feeding yourself, having a bit of change to go to a movie. There are lots of things you can do with money. No one doubts its instrumental value. The question is whether some ends or purposes are intelligible as providing more than merely instrumental reasons for acting. Are there intrinsic as well as instrumental goods? Now, there are certain skeptics who deny that there are intelligible ends or purposes that make possible morally or rationally motivated action. Natural law theorists, by contrast, hold that friendship, knowledge, the pursuit of knowledge, critical aesthetic appreciation, the appreciation of art or beautiful form, and certain other ends or purposes are indeed intrinsically valuable. When we enter into a friendship, if it's a real friendship, you don't enter into the friendship for what you can get out of your friend. If you're simply using your friend because your friend has connections that might get you a job, or your friend is friends with the beautiful people who can get you invited to the fancy parties in Manhattan, whatever that is, that's not a friendship. So if there is really an intelligible reason provided by the reality or the possibility of friendship, then it is on an understanding of friendship as something worthwhile, not merely as a means to other ends, but as an end in itself. Now, that's not to say that something like friendship that's intrinsically valuable can't also have important instrumental value. It might be that because I'm friends with Micah, I get invited to all the parties because Micah's friends with all the beautiful people. Or because I'm friends with Elsa, I can get a great job because she is friendly with the big magnates in Wall Street and so forth. But it's not the instrumental value that is the fundamental motivation for the friendship. Or if it is, then whatever that is, it's not a friendship. It might be a mutual using of each other. It might not be morally wrong, but it's not a friendship. Well, now if I and other natural law theorists are correct in affirming that human reason can identify basic human goods, things that are more than merely instrumentally worthwhile, aspects of human well-being and fulfillment that are what we respect when we talk about the respect for human dignity that persons are owed simply by virtue of their humanity, if we're correct in affirming that there can be such things as human rights that shouldn't be violated, how can we explain or understand widespread failures to recognize and respect human rights and other moral principles? If there's one thing we know about human history, as Cornel West says, it's a slaughterhouse. The history of humanity is a history of exploitation, injustice, hatred, bigotry, selfishness, greed. There was this guy, Calvin, who taught us a thing or two about the depravity of human nature. So, how do we explain that? If in fact there are such things as human rights, why are they violated all the time throughout history? Until the 19th century, almost everybody thought there was nothing really wrong in principle with slavery. Well, as human beings, we are rational animals, rational creatures, but we are imperfectly rational. We are prone to making intellectual and moral mistakes and capable of behaving grossly unreasonably, especially when deflected by powerful emotions that run contrary to the demands of reasonableness. Christians have a name for this. We call it sin. And another name, fallenness. We suffer weakness of the will and darkness of the intellect. Even when following our consciences, as we are morally bound to do, we can get it wrong and go wrong. A judgment made authentically in conscience can nevertheless be erroneous. That's our human condition. Someone can, in good conscience, think they're doing the right thing. But us poor, frail, fallen, fallible human beings might nevertheless be doing exactly the wrong thing. Of course, sometimes people fail to recognize and respect human rights because they have self-interested motives for doing so. In most cases of exploitation, for example, the fundamental failing is moral, not intellectual. People who exploit other people usually know that they're doing something wrong. In some cases, though, intellectual and moral failures are closely connected. Selfishness, prejudice, partisanship, vanity, avarice, lust, ill will, and other moral delinquencies can, in ways that are sometimes really quite subtle, impede sound moral judgments, including judgments pertaining to human rights. When something is really, really in our interests and we want it really, really badly, but the problem is that there's somebody else's interest in the way here, and we pause to think, gee, I could have that thing that I really, really, really want. It would be really good for me to have, and I could do really good things with, but I'm going to have to run over the interests of this other person. The temptation to decide that whatever that interest of the other person is, it doesn't actually qualify as a human right, is very profound. And standing up against that, standing up to yourself, takes a kind of strength of character which all of us find very challenging to muster. Whole cultures or subcultures can be infected with moral failings that blind large numbers of people, could be everybody in the culture, to truths, fundamental truths about human rights, about justice. And ideologies hostile to these truths will almost always be both causes and effects of those failings. Consider, for example, slavery again. Consider slavery, race-based chattel slavery in the American South. The ideology of white supremacy was both a cause of many people's blindness to the wickedness of slavery and an effect of the exploitation and degradation of the slaves. Now, as I promised, let us turn to the question of God, or more fully to the question of God and religious faith in natural law theories. Most, though not all, natural law theorists are theists. I myself am a theist. As Micah said, I'm a Christian. They believe, that is, we theists believe, that the moral order, like every other order in human experience, is what it is because God creates and sustains it as such. In accounting for the intelligibility of the created order, we infer from the existence of a free and creative intelligence. That's what we mean by a personal God. Indeed, we typically argue that God's creative free choices provide the only ultimately satisfactory account of the existence of the intelligibilities that humans grasp in every domain of inquiry, not just in the moral domain, how do we know right from wrong, but in the domain of natural sciences, physics, chemistry, biology, in the domain of social sciences, economics, political science, sociology, and so forth. Now, natural law theorists do not deny that God can reveal moral truths, and most of us believe that God has chosen to reveal many such truths. Christian natural law theorists and Jewish natural law theorists, like the great contemporary Jewish natural law theorist David Novak, believe that God reveals many moral truths in the Scripture. However, natural law theorists also affirm that many moral truths, including some that are also revealed, can be grasped by ethical reflection, even apart from revelation. They assert with St. Paul that there is a law, you'll recall the letter to the Romans here, written on the hearts even of the Gentiles who do not have the law of Moses, a law the knowledge of which is sufficient for moral accountability, and St. Paul says, indeed, judgment. So the basic norms against murder and theft, for example, though revealed in the Decalogue, with my students these days, when I say the Decalogue, I have to say, now Decalogue, I mean 10 commandments. And then they'll look at me blindly and say, yeah, well, what are they? Anyway, they are revealed in the Decalogue and yet also knowable, even by people who know nothing of the Decalogue, like some of my students these days. The natural law can be known by us, and we can conform our conduct to its terms by virtue of our natural human capacities for deliberation, judgment, and choice. The absence of a divine source for the natural law would be a puzzling thing indeed, just as the absence of a divine source of any and every other intelligibility or intelligible order in the human experience would be a puzzling thing. An atheist's puzzlement might well cause him to reconsider the idea that there is no divine source of the order we perceive and understand in the universe, and many people precisely on that ground have converted from atheistic or secularist views to religious, often Christian views. But in any case, it's far less likely, I think, to cause someone to conclude that our perception is illusory or that our understanding is a sham, though that's certainly logically possible. The question then arises, can natural law, assuming that there truly are principles of natural law, provide some measure of common moral and even political ground for people who do not agree on the existence or nature of God and the role of God in human affairs? Well, in my own view, anybody who acknowledges the human capacities for reason and freedom has good grounds for affirming human dignity and human rights, even before or apart from adverting to theological questions. And these grounds remain in place whether or not one does then turn to those questions, asking, for example, is there a divine source of the moral order whose tenets we discern in inquiry regarding natural law and natural rights? Now, I happen to think that the answer to that question is yes, and that we should be open to the possibility that God has indeed revealed himself in ways that reinforce and supplement what can be known by what's sometimes called unaided reason. But we do not need to agree on the answer so long as we agree about the truths that give rise to the question, namely, that human beings possessing those godlike, literally, for once we can use the word correctly, awesome powers of reason and freedom are bearers of profound, inherent, and equal dignity, the dignity that is protected by human rights. So, if there is a set of moral norms, including norms of justice and human rights, that can be known by rational inquiry, understanding, and judgment, even apart from special revelation, then these norms of natural law can indeed provide the basis of a common understanding of human rights, a cross-cultural understanding, an understanding that can be shared even in the absence of religious agreement, an understanding that can be shared by Christians and Jews, and those of biblical faiths and Muslims, and those of Eastern faiths and not just the ethical monotheistic traditions, one that can be affirmed by Buddhists and Hindus as well as Christians and Jews and Muslims. Now, of course, it would be foolish to expect consensus. In this vale of tears, we don't get consensus.
There are moral skeptics who deny that there are any moral truths. They're mostly at universities, but they do exist. There are religious fideists who insist that moral truths cannot be known apart from God's special revelation. And even among those who believe in natural law and natural rights, there will be differences of opinion about their content and implications for certain issues. Ethical inquiry, ethical deliberation, ethical judgment, ethical discussion is often hard. Not all moral issues are easy. Depending on the cultural circumstances, even an issue that should, in the abstract, be easy, like slavery, can be not easy. It's not being easy in the cultural circumstances most people were in for most of history explains why, until the 19th century, almost nobody thought that there was really anything wrong with slavery. So, it is, I believe, our permanent condition to discuss and debate these issues, both as a matter of abstract philosophy and as a matter of practical politics. So I don't think that even if you agree with me about what I've said thus far, that means that we're going to close the ethical conversation anytime soon, that we're going to stop debating issues and everybody's going to agree. That's not going to happen. You can believe absolutely everything I just said, and we would still have profound and important debates that will likely never come to an end until Jesus returns in glory over the application of the principles to existing circumstances or to future circumstances when we face new and unheard of and unexpected ethical challenges arising out of technology or world affairs or what have you. Now, it's sometimes regarded as an embarrassment to natural law thinking that some great ancient and medieval figures in the natural law tradition, some of the founding fathers, some of the great heroes, figures like Plato and Aristotle, St. Thomas Aquinas, Maimonides, failed to recognize, and indeed in some cases even denied, human rights that are affirmed by contemporary natural law theorists and even regarded as fundamental. Again, we could use the example of slavery. But we can use another example. Consider the example of the basic human right affirmed by our Constitution, affirmed by the UN Declaration of 1948, to religious liberty, or what we in America refer to as the free exercise of religion. That right was not widely acknowledged in the past, even by natural law theorists, not by Aristotle, not by St. Thomas Aquinas, and was even denied by some. As my own teacher, John Finnis, has observed, they wrongly believed that a wide conception of liberty in matters of faith presupposed religious relativism or indifferentism, or entailed that religious vows were immoral or non-binding, or the comprehensive subservience of ecclesial communities to the state. What they were worried about, certainly in the wake of the French Revolution, the wake of 1789 and then the Terror, was the French revolutionary conception of religious freedom, which would have given you all of those things that, of course, no serious Christian could agree with. Now, it's interesting that when the Catholic Church got around to putting itself on record firmly in support of the right to religious freedom in the document Dignitatis Humanae of the Second Vatican Council, that's as late as 1965, so it's very late. It presented both a natural law argument and an argument from specifically theological sources. The first half of the document is a straight-up natural law argument. There's no invocation of Scripture, no invocation of the authority of the Christian church or the Christian tradition or the councils of the church or anything like that. The natural law argument for religious liberty is founded on the obligation of each person to pursue the truth about religious matters, and then to do his or her best to live in conformity with his or her conscientious judgments, to live the way you should live if this is what you in fact believe about God and God's relationship to man. This obligation is in turn rooted in the proposition that religion, considered as conscientious truth-seeking regarding the ultimate sources of meaning and value, the spiritual life, is one of those crucial dimensions of human well-being and fulfillment, one of those basic human goods. It provides a rational motivation for our action, getting ourselves to church, reading the Bible, trying to be in a relationship of friendship with God. The right to religious liberty follows from the dignity of man as a conscientious truth seeker when we're at our best. This right and other human rights are denied and attacked today from various quarters, not from just one side. And in many parts of the world, they are, of course, still to this day routinely violated. The ideological justification for their denial and violation can be religious or secular. In some parts of the world, religious freedom and other basic human rights are denied in the name of theological truth. Think about Iran. Think about Saudi Arabia. I spent a couple of terms chairing the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, and even I, who thought I knew, at least something about what was going on in the world, was just shocked and stunned at the gross violations of fundamental principles of religious liberty that you found in those and other societies. But where secularist ideologies exist, we find the same thing. Think of China, North Korea, Vietnam. And where secularist ideologies are liberal in form, as they are in the West, it's often claims to an overarching right to autonomy, or a corrupted version of the true right to have one's equal dignity respected, that are asserted to justify choices and actions and policies that natural law theorists believe are unjust and undermine the common good. Well, if the natural law view of these matters is correct, then it is moral failings conspiring with intellectual errors that sustain ideologies that compromise human rights. In a certain sense, the failings are at opposite poles. Yet from a natural law vantage point, partisans of the competing ideologies make some valid criticisms of each other. Militant religious fundamentalists, for example, in Iran or Saudi Arabia, harshly condemn the decadent features of cultures in which the me generation ideology of if it feels good, do it, flourishes. They're not wrong about that. When they look at some of the stuff that goes on in the West, they're right not to want that for their own people. On the other side, ideological liberals denounce the subjugation of women and the oppression of religious dissenters, where religious fundamentalism holds sway. And they're right too. They're right about that. When you see what goes on in Iran, or Afghanistan now, Saudi Arabia, Sudan, Somalia, Cuba, when you see what goes on, well, that's right. Now, as a natural law theorist sees it, threats to human dignity and human rights exist because all of us as human beings are imperfectly reasonable and so imperfectly moral. To put it in Christian terms, we are fallen creatures, sinners. At the same time, hope exists because we really do possess those godlike capacities for reasonableness and freedom, for virtue. Truth, including moral truth, is accessible to us and has its own splendor and powerful appeal. We can be, by the grace of God, converted. Now, we will never, in this vale of tears, grasp the truth completely or in a way that is entirely free from errors. I think one fact about us, one fact about all of us and everybody else that shares this planet with us is that even right now, every single one of us has some false beliefs in his or her head. Am I right, or is there anybody out there who has only true beliefs right now in your... Oh, that lady has only true beliefs, yeah. What a great husband, yeah. No, we all know that even now we have some false beliefs in our head. The problem is we don't know which ones are false. And all of us can have false beliefs not only about the minor, trivial, superficial things in life that we don't that much care about. We can have false beliefs about the big, important, profound questions, the questions of meaning and value that we really do care about. So we're frail and we are fallible and we are fallen. So we're never going to grasp the truth completely or entirely free from errors, nor, alas, Will we fully live up to those moral truths that we do grasp? St. Paul's right. The good that I would do, I don't do. The evil that I would not do, I do. We all know that experience. It's human. But just as we made progress by abolishing the evil of slavery, by ending legally sanctioned racial segregation in the United States, by recognizing the right to religious freedom, and by turning away from the eugenics policies once favored by so many respectable people at places like Princeton and Harvard, though that one, alas, is coming back, natural law theorists hope that we can make progress and reverse declines in other areas. Now, of course, people who reject the natural law understanding of human dignity and human rights will differ from natural law theorists on questions of what constitutes progress and what constitutes decline. From certain religious fundamentalist points of view, the type of religious freedom defended by someone like me will be regarded as licensing heresy and religious irresponsibility. That's basically in my engagements when I was chairing the Commission on International Religious Freedom, my engagement with some of my interlocutors, ambassadors or justice ministers in places like Saudi Arabia, basically they had such a polite way of saying that, well, what you're licensing, what you stand for is immorality. Your freedom of religion clause in your Constitution, your freedom of speech clause, those are just pretexts for immorality. You're just trying to protect immorality. By contrast, from the perspective of certain secularist ideologies, natural law ideas about abortion and sexuality and other hot-button moral issues will be regarded as intolerant and oppressive, a philosophically gussied-up form of religious fundamentalism. You've all heard that. In the end, though, natural law ideas, like the ideas proposed by any school of thought, be it religious or secular, will have to stand or fall on their merits. You can either make the case or you don't. You have to decide whether you think the case has been made or hasn't been made. Anyone who wonders whether they are sound or unsound will have to consider the arguments advanced by their proponents or supporters and the counter-arguments advanced by their critics. And the way human beings come manufactured, we have no choice but to think for ourselves and make up our minds. The one thing you cannot outsource in this life is thinking. It's something you've got to do for yourself. Now, as I observed earlier, there are competing accounts of natural law and natural rights among people who have been or are regarded or regard themselves as natural law theorists. In my own writings, I've associated myself with what's sometimes called the new natural law theory. In order to save time for more engagement in the Q&A, I'm not going to go through right now what the differences between so-called old natural law theorists and new natural law theorists are, but since that is a subject that might be of interest to some in the audience, do feel free to ask me about it in the Q&A, but I'll skip it now in order to reserve time. And then I want to turn to those last two questions that I promised to answer at the beginning. Now, the first one has to do with the respects in which natural law theories are like and unlike the leading competing accounts of ethical or moral judgment. Well, like utilitarian approaches, and unlike Kantian or deontologist ones, natural law theories are fundamentally concerned with human well-being and fulfillment. Indeed, identifying principles directing our choosing toward the human good and away from privations of the human good. Those, for the natural law theorist, are the starting points of all ethical reflection. This is a point that someone like me would have in common with someone from whom I seem and am very, very distant, my Princeton colleague Peter Singer, who's the leading proponent of utilitarianism in contemporary philosophy, the true successor to Jeremy Bentham in our own period. Well, Peter and I agree on one thing, and that is that morality is fundamentally about the human good. All right? There are other people who think we have to abstract from questions of the human good in order to make sound moral judgments. So that's how natural law theories are like utilitarian approaches. How about how they're unlike? Well, unlike utilitarian approaches, Natural law theorists understand the basic forms of human good as they figure in our options for morally significant choosing as incommensurable in ways that render senseless the utilitarian strategy of choosing the option that overall and in the long run promise the net best proportion of benefit to harm, however benefit and harm may be understood and defined. In other words, unlike utilitarians, unlike Peter Singer, I don't think that there is such a thing as the greatest happiness of the greatest number. You can't quantify human goods in a way that would enable you to do a calculation of human happiness or the human good overall. So I don't think ethics can proceed in the way he thinks it can proceed, even though we both agree that all ethical reflection begins with trying to figure out what is and isn't for the human good. So natural law theorists share with Kantians, that is, the disciples of Immanuel Kant, the rejection of aggregative accounts of morality that regard the achievement of sufficiently good consequences or the avoidance of sufficiently bad ones as justifying choices that would be excluded by application of moral principles in ordinary circumstances. So, to put it the way my mother would put it, or perhaps your mother would put it, even a very, very, very good end does not justify a bad means. Unlike Kantians, however, natural law theorists do not believe that moral norms can be identified and justified apart from a consideration of the human good, of the integral directiveness of those principles directing our choices and actions toward what is humanly fulfilling and away from what is contrary to human well-being. Natural law theorists, in other words, do not believe in purely deontological moral norms. Our moral reasoning is reasoning about both the right and the good, and the two are connected. The content of the human good shapes moral norms inasmuch as such norms are entailments of the basic aspects of human well-being and fulfillment conceived integrally. That is, conceived as a whole. That is, conceived in a way that tries to understand what it means for a human being to flourish across all those dimensions of a human life in respect of his or her health, intellect, character, sociability and friendship, spiritual life. Such a view presupposes, of course, the possibility of free choice, that is, choosing which is the pure product of neither external choices nor internal but sub-rational motivating factors, such as sheer desire. So a complete theory of natural law will include an account of principles of practical reason, principles of moral judgment, for the guidance of choices that we're not forced to make, and a defense of that. And this will entail the rejection of strict rationalism, according to which all phenomena are viewed as caused. It understands human beings, at least some human beings, at least sometimes, as capable of causing realities that they bring into existence for reasons and by free choices. That is, they're not caused to do it. There aren't forces operating on them that make them do what they do. Skipping ahead to that final question. One more proposition stressed by natural law theorists, namely the fact, or in any event what I believe to be the fact, that we human beings, by our choices and actions, not only alter states of affairs external to us in the world, although our choices and actions do that. Whatever we do makes the world a little different from what it would be, the world being the world external to us. That happens, but not only does that happen, our choices also at the same time determine and constitute ourselves for better or worse. Our morally significant choices constitute ourselves, and don't just alter the states of affairs in the world, as good or bad people, as virtuous or as people lacking in virtue. Virtues or vices. Recognition of this self-shaping or intransitive quality of morally significant choosing leads to a focus on virtues as habits born of upright choosing that orient and dispose us toward further upright choosing, especially in the face of temptation to behave immorally, which we will all from time to time, of course, experience. So people ask, well, look, is natural law about rules, moral rules? Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. treat humanity, whether in the person of yourself or another, always as an end, neither and not as a means only, never as a means only. Is that what it's about? Or is it about virtues? Prudence, temperance, courage, humility, the theological virtues, faith, hope, and the greatest of these, love. Which is it? Well, the answer, it seems to me, is that is not a choice that we should make, because it's about both, and they are inextricably bound together. A complete theory of natural law identifies norms for distinguishing right from wrong, rules, as well as habits or traits of character, virtues, whose cultivation disposes us to choose in conformity with those norms, those rules, and thus compatibly with what we might call, borrowing a phrase from Kant, a good will. That is, a will toward the integral human fulfillment of ourselves and our fellow human beings. Thank you. Let's go on to Q&A.
We have some time for Q&A. Notice that it's Q&A, not A&A. So please do give us your name and then quickly move to a question.
If you have anything, raise your hand and I will bring the mic over to you.
Thanks, Professor George, for that truly edifying lecture. My question is about embodiment.
Is about what?
Embodiment.
Embodiment. Oh, yeah. Okay. I've got a book on that. Yeah.
I know. So I want to give you. I want to hear a little bit from you about the relationship of the Imago Dei as you've defined it to the reality of our embodiment, and then the significance of our embodiment for human dignity.
Okay, boy, big abstract question. So, Christianity early on, and Judaism as well, had to wrestle with the following question. Are we, whatever else we are, our physical bodies? Or are we spirits, souls, minds, centers of consciousness or desire that merely inhabit material bodies and use them for our extrinsic ends? Is the real self not the body, but some immaterial substance that resides in the body and treats the body as a vehicle? Is the soul, or to secularize it, the mind, like the driver in a car, who's not the car? The car is just an instrument of the driver. Those early Christian, we would now say heretics, there was a time when there was a fight for what would be orthodox and what would be heretical. Those early heretics that we know as the Gnostics believed a lot of different things, including the idea that there was a special elect or elite that had certain special knowledge not available to the rest of us, religious knowledge not available to the rest of us. But another belief that they held was that the body is not part of the personal reality of the human being. It's a separate substance from the soul or the mind, and the soul or the mind is the real me, the real self, and the body is just an extrinsic instrument. So their conception of the human being was as what we might today call a ghost in a machine. What we are on that account are non-bodily persons, souls, minds, spirits, who inhabit and use non-personal bodies. That was the view that came to be declared heretical when Christianity rejected Gnosticism. We go all the way back to the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Irenaeus' treatise against the heresies. He's got the Gnostics directly in his sight. And the view that prevailed is a view that we've given a Greek name to, because it is articulated and defended by Aristotle, which is sometimes called hylomorphism. That's the Greek name.
The hylomorphic view of the human person is that we are not ghosts in machines. We are not immaterial selves that inhabit and use material bodies as extrinsic objects. We are not simply material, but the material body is part of the personal reality of ourselves. So we are body-soul composites. Our bodies are as much us, truly us, as our minds are. This explains why the early Christians went to the mat and sometimes to the cross for the doctrine of the resurrection of the body. It would have been so much easier and so much safer to have just told the ancient authorities, Jesus died on the cross, you crucified him, he died on the cross, and his soul went to heaven, and his body is still there in the tomb. But given their experience of the resurrected Jesus, they couldn't say that. Jesus eats the fish on the shore, the resurrected Jesus. He's sending them a signal. He's telling them something. There's a reason the gospel tells us he eats the fish. He's embodied. It would have been so much easier to tell the authorities in the ancient world, in Rome, that when we die, our souls go to heaven, our bodies rot away in the grave, and that's it, and we live eternally with God as souls, disembodied spirits, like angels. But that's not the Christian story. That's not the Jewish story and the sect of Judaism that prevails even to this day. It was the view of some Jewish thinkers at the time, but it gets rejected just as it does in Christianity, in favor of what we, using the Greek label, would call the hylomorphic view. So that when we die, our souls await the resurrection of the body. In fact, Christians have been of two minds historically, and the Christian church as a whole has actually never fundamentally, decisively in the end, resolved this question about whether, if we can think in temporal terms, and it's hard to do this, to think in temporal terms about eternity, but just to put it in temporal terms strugglingly, unsatisfactorily, Christians have disagreed about the following. When we die, and our souls live on, but we're dead, do we not exist only to be brought into existence with the resurrection of the body? Do we have spiritual remains like our physical remains? But do we really, as ourselves, as the human beings we are, not exist until the resurrection? Or do we exist as souls separated from the body, but only in a mutilated form? Aquinas, a great thinker in the medieval period, and somebody who thought really deeply about all these kinds of issues, was inclined to the first of those views. I think most Christians, and certainly in the Catholic Church, I think in most Christian traditions, incline more to the second of those views. But what they have in common is the belief that we are our bodies, whatever else we are. Our bodies are not sub-personal instruments of ourselves. They are part of our personal reality as human beings. And if I can refer you to one of my writings, in 2016 I wrote an essay in First Things magazine called Gnostic Liberalism, in which I think it's fair to say, well, let me just say, I claim to show, I think I actually show, but let me say I claim to show that many of the most divisive issues that separate us today reflect the division between people who believe that a human being is a ghost in a machine. Whether they advert to that belief or not, whether they know they hold it or not, they're implicitly believing that the real me is the psyche, the mind, to put a religious spin on it, the spirit or the soul, and the body is not the real me, it's a subpersonal instrument. Abortion turns on that question. Same-sex marriage turns on that question. Transgender ideology manifestly turns on that question. If we are our bodies and don't merely inhabit them, whatever else we are, doesn't mean that we're merely material, But if we are our bodies, if they're part of our personal reality as human beings, then we exist from when our bodies come into existence. And you know when that is. That's a matter of scientifically determined fact. That is not actually a debatable issue. If we're not, if we're our psyches, then as Peter Singer argues, merely being a human being doesn't make you a person. You might not become a person until, as Professor Singer argues, 28 days or 6 months after birth. And therefore, there's nothing wrong in principle with killing you in utero or as a newborn or perhaps even as a 6-month-old. Because you're not this biological thing, the human being, that's not you. You are the psyche. And until, let's say, an infant child has a certain degree of self-awareness or rationality, that's a human being, but it's not a person. Same with sexuality. If my body isn't me, if me is some immaterial substance that inhabits the body, or is associated in some mysterious way with the body, then if there's a dysphoria, if there's a gap between my physical body and my sense of myself as one sex or the other, then what matters is my sense of myself as one sex or the other, not my physical body as male or female. And there's a similar argument that I outline in there for abortion, for same-sex marriage and other sexuality issues. So I think that this question of embodiment is of profound moral significance and is not just an abstract moral question. And the book that I wrote with Pat Lee on the subject is entitled Self-Body Dualism in Ethics and Politics.
Hi, I'm Mark Taylor. So I have a similar question about human dignity, but it's actually about disembodiment. In particular, how this relates to the angels. So if human dignity is grounded in these specific faculties of human nature, those are faculties that are possessed by the angels as well. It's not traditionally thought that the angels are made in God's image as humans are, even though they possess those faculties. And the fallen angels are thought to have a greatly diminished dignity as a result of what they've done. But if dignity is something that is in our faculties rather than in our something we merit, then it seems like we have to say, well, no, there's something dignified about the fallen angels as well.
Yeah, it's a tough question. Of course, Christian theologians have forever argued about it. Part of the problem is we can't know enough about angels really to give fallen or non-fallen, to give a satisfactory answer to the question. It's an area of, the best we can hope for is just informed theological speculation. This much, though, I think we can say, the angels, whether fallen or not, are personal. And that in that respect, they are godlike. You're right that there's no official Christian teaching that angels are made in the image and likeness of God. But they are personal, and in that respect, they are godlike. God is personal, human beings are personal, angels are personal. Now, we might ask, well, gee, can persons be eternally lost the way the fallen angels are? And it seems to me the Christian answer to that is, well, yes, because human beings made in the image and likeness of God can be permanently and eternally lost in the same way through sin. So, I have to leave any more detailed analysis to theologians who know a lot more about the theological data than I do. But as a philosophical matter, I think we can go that far. We do have to recognize the personal nature of angelic beings, fallen or unfallen, and the whatever dignity attaches to beings in virtue of being personal creatures. Understanding that whatever that dignity is, it doesn't prevent the possibility of eternal damnation. I don't get asked questions like that at most places that I speak.
And my name is Ann Portinga, and thank you for your talk today. I'm just going to follow on the same theme, and I think you set the stage with the question about embodiment. So I'm wondering about the definition a pretty classic definition of human dignity, right? But it struck me as you were talking about these awesome, godlike capacities and agency and all of that. If it should be expanded, I mean, then you went and talked all about how important the body was, but it's not part of your definition of human dignity. And then also if you would address humans who are unable to exercise that agency and how that impacts the view of dignity.
Otherwise, I'm tethered. I'll be tethered. Okay. Yeah, thank you very much for that great question. Let me begin with the end, and then can you bring me back to the one at the beginning, because I really am interested and have thought a lot about the question at the end. And I've treated it in some of my writings in my book, Embryo, A Defense of Human Life, for example, and in the essay that I did for Daedalus, the Journal of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, called Embryo Ethics. So I'll do my best right now extemporaneously, but since you're interested in those issues, you could just look. In both cases, I've treated it in footnotes. I shouldn't. It should be in the text, but I treated it in footnotes. Okay, so what is the ground of our dignity? If I'm right that it has to do with our literally godlike, awesome capacities for human deliberation, judgment, and choice, agency, then there are two possibilities. It's either the immediately exercisable capacities for deliberation, judgment, and choice, which come and go, which develop over time, which are not present in some human beings and are present in others. For all our differences, Peter Singer and I agree that it's got to have something to do with those capacities. He doesn't buy the made in the image and likeness of God part. But he does accept the idea that it's those capacities. But he thinks it has to be the immediately exercisable capacities. The alternative is the basic natural capacities. That is, the capacities that exist in even an embryonic human being, a person in a cognitively disabled, severely cognitively disabled state, and so a person suffering from a dementia, even though they don't yet have or never will have or had and lost the immediately exercisable capacities. It seems to me it has to be the latter for the following reasons. This is why I think Peter's wrong to think it's the immediately exercisable ones. Even Peter agrees we have our basic dignity. He wouldn't speak in terms of rights because a utilitarian won't. But we have our rights for those who believe in human rights. When we're asleep, when we're in a temporary coma, when we're under a anesthesia, what do they call it when it's a complete anesthesia? Full anesthesia. You know, when you're having a heart surgery or something like that, and you're under full anesthesia, you could be out in some cases, put in a temporary coma for months. You would still have your basic dignity, even though it wouldn't be immediately exercisable, maybe for a very long time, or maybe it's speculative about where it ever would. Beyond that, I'd make the following point, which seems to me very important. If, by some miracle, or perhaps by some technology, a severely cognitively disabled person could be cured, healed of the cognitive disability, even though as far as we can tell, that's not going to happen. As far as we can see right now, that person's forever going to be, until he dies, that person's going to be a cognitively disabled person. If by some miracle or some technology we haven't yet foreseen, he could be cured or healed, he would be a human being when he would be a person when he's healed or cured, and not simply a human non-person, which is what Peter thinks he is now. So in his view, of course that cognitively disabled person, like that infant or like that fetus or like that embryo, is a human being. That's a matter of biological fact. Peter's very good about that. Peter Singer's very good about that. He doesn't deny the science. He says, of course they're human beings. What do you think they are? But they're not persons yet. But if you took a cognitively disabled person
and could cure him by some magic or by some technology, you wouldn't be changing that human being from one kind of thing into another. You would be rather perfecting that creature as precisely the kind of thing he is, that is, a rational creature. By contrast, if you somehow by some magic caused a horse to talk, remember, well, you're too young. Elsa, do you remember Mr. Ed? You and I can remember Mr. Ed, the talking horse. Can you remember Mr. Ed? Okay, you would not actually be perfecting that horse as the kind of thing it is. You would be changing the nature of the horse. You would be changing it from one kind of thing into another. So it seems to me that the thing that's got to matter is the kind of thing you are. In other words, it's your nature. It's your nature as a rational creature. It's your human nature. It's not the immediately exercisable capacities that you only have as immediately exercisable because they were there as radical capacities, that is, root capacities, basic natural capacities, even before they became, or in the hiatus before they became natural, immediately exercisable capacities. So that's how I think about your last point. Now, take me back to the earlier one.
I was feeling like as you were talking about Gnosticism, that your definition of human dignity sounds a little Gnostic to me, right? Just because it's separate, there's no mention of the body at all, no root of human dignity in our environment. And I don't know if that's what...
Oh, no. Yeah, I think I handled this one. Yeah, it's our rationality is actually made possible by our biological makeup. Our biological makeup is not separate to it. We have somatic conditions for our rationality. Now, we can't know much about angels. We have very little data. But what we know about them is that their rationality is not rooted in somatic factors. So I'm actually denying what would be the premise of the critique, I think, that I'm assuming the separation of body and spirit that I'm actually affirming, that I'm affirming as united, not as separated. I think to get to the critique, you have to assume that I'm separating them.
Right, and maybe it's not a critique so much as a clarification. When you speak like this, it doesn't, to me, sound immediately like a body is involved. So it's just a point of...
So if we were angels, I think we would still be personal, because angels are agents. They have agency, but they wouldn't have bodies. Then we would be angels. We have bodies, and those bodies are connected to our rational. The way that we are able to have agency is in virtue of our biological makeup. Now, theologically, we ask the question, well, why is that the case? Well, that's the way God made us. Presumably, God could have made us differently. He made the angels differently.
We have time for one more.
Hi, my name is Joe. My question is actually quite short, I think. Are human rights absolute?
Not all. Not all. So some human rights are absolute. If by absolute you mean exceptionless? Yeah. So I think the right of a human person not to be directly killed, where directly means death is intended whether as an end in itself or as a means to some other end, as opposed to death being the result, being a side effect of some otherwise morally acceptable action, like setting the speed limit at 70. You set the speed limit at 70 rather than 20. You know as a side effect of that there are going to be more deaths on the highways than there otherwise would be. You haven't violated anybody's human right. But if you kill somebody because you want their money, or you kill somebody because you don't like them, or you kill somebody because you're the beneficiary on the insurance policy, you want to cover the insurance, that's a violation of the human rights. Exceptionless in my view. There's nothing to be done about that. Understood properly and specified properly, I think the right to religious liberty is also exceptionless. Now, there's a possibility very quickly of being misled, because I'm not saying that anything you do because of a truly sincere religious motive is protected by that right. That's not it. What's exceptionless is the body of things that you can do out of religious conviction and for religious purposes in order to get right with God or maintain your friendship with God or what have you. Those things that you can do consistently with the rights of others and the protection of the common good, those are exceptionless. So you can't, on a utilitarian basis, in my view, justify squashing them for the sake of some higher, allegedly higher good or something like that. But there are other things that in ordinary circumstances you would have the right to, but in some extraordinary, exceptional circumstances, that right can legitimately be curtailed. And I want to distinguish those kinds of cases. And then there are other things that aren't rights at all. They're just privileges that can legitimately be taken away for any good reason, so long as you don't do it in an invidiously discriminatory manner. It's not invidiously discriminatory if you say 17-year-olds can't get driver's licenses, but 18-year-olds can. It is invidious if you say Croatians can get driver's license, but Bulgarians can't. Okay? Look, thanks everyone for coming out. Really pleasure to be at Calvin. Thank you.